Welcome to Shift Change, the Idaho Manufacturing Podcast. Over the course of about 20 minutes, we bring you conversations on AI, tech, and the future of Idaho manufacturing. Funding for this program comes from Total Care IT, your Idaho-based IT and cybersecurity partner for manufacturers.
We're here not just to skim the surface of complex rules, but really to break down the source material, give you that critical, actionable intelligence you need, to stay competitive, stay secure. And our mission today, it's foundational, it's practical, and it's specifically for you, the Idaho manufacturing executives, staring down these new cybersecurity maturity model certification requirements. CMMC. Look, for manufacturers in the defense industrial base, the DIB cybersecurity isn't optional anymore. It can't be reactive. CMMC, that's the DoD basically saying structured, verified compliance. It's now mandatory. It's a condition of doing business. We're here to help you maybe see compliance less as a barrier and more potentially as a competitive edge.
Absolutely. And turning that corner is critical because, well, the stakes are just incredibly high. Our sources are clear. Cyber actors are relentless. They're targeting the DIB supply chain constantly. And they often look for the perceived weak links, right? Which unfortunately often means smaller entities.
Smaller manufacturers.
Exactly. These companies might hold really valuable IP or that controlled unclassified information CUI. And the theft of this data, often piece by piece from subcontractors, it adds up. It directly threatens U.S. national security, our technological lead. CMMC is the DoD's way of creating a scalable, standard approach. It's about verifying that the existing standards, the ones meant to protect this info, are actually being followed.
Okay, so let's anchor this whole conversation. There's one critical timeline everyone needs burned into their minds. Phase 1 of CMMC. The clock is ticking for compliance, and from everything we're seeing, that date is coming up fast. So if you want your company, doesn't matter if you're a prime contractor or a small Tier 3 supplier, if you want to stay eligible for contracts heading into 2025 and beyond, well, the time to build that foundation is literally right now.
Yeah, we really want to cut through the noise today, help you get some clarity. The goal is to unpack exactly who has to comply. What does this Phase 1 self-assessment focus really mean, especially regarding executive liability? And maybe most importantly, what are the essential tasks a manufacturing executive needs to get their team moving on, like this week, to establish a solid, defensible starting point? We want to move you from maybe confusion to structured progress.
Okay, let's really unpack this CMMC mandate. We need total clarity here. What exactly is CMMC? And who, specifically thinking about those thousands of manufacturers right here in Idaho, who does it actually apply to?
Right. So at its heart, CMMC is a unified standard. The Department of Defense put it together. It basically lays out verifiable requirements for defense contractors, subcontractors too, at every single tier. They have to implement specific cybersecurity practices, and the mandate applies to any entity that processes or stores or transmits two key types of sensitive government-related data, all in support of a DoD contract or subcontract, of course. The first category, the one with, let's say, less stringent requirements, is federal contract information, FCI.
FCI.
Yeah. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, defines it. It's information not meant for public release, and it's either provided by the government or generated for the government under a contract. So think about it from a manufacturer's perspective. If you get basic documents, delivery schedules, maybe invoices, standard operating procedures, stuff that isn't public knowledge, you're handling FCI.
Okay, that seems pretty broad. What about the second category, the one I assume brings significantly higher requirements?
That's right. That's Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI. Now, this is info the government has, or that you have on behalf of the government, that needs safeguarding. Specific controls for dissemination, usually based on law, regulation, or government-wide policy. For a manufacturer, this could be technical drawings, engineering specs, detailed performance requirements, really any data that's actually marked with a CUI designation.
So if your job involves taking a DoD requirement and turning it into a physical product,
you are almost certainly handling CUI.
Yeah.
And that definitely pushes you into a much stricter compliance environment.
Makes sense. And the CMMC structure itself tries to mirror that risk difference, right, with those three streamlined levels. Can you walk us through those levels quickly? Because that really defines the scope of work for the executives listening in.
Certainly. It is streamlined, but it's quite precise. First, you've got level 1, foundational. This is purely about protecting FCI. Just FCI. It's made up of 15 security requirements. They come straight from that FAR clause, 52.204D by 1. Think of it as like basic cyber hygiene, using antivirus, making sure staff authenticate properly, simple stuff mostly.
And the assessment.
For level 1, it's a self-assessment annually, and it has to be affirmed by the company's senior official, signed off.
Okay, level 2.
Level 2, advanced. Now we're talking about protecting CUI. This is the big one. It's where the vast majority of DIB contractors are going to land. It covers the full 110 security requirements from NIST SP 800-171 Revision 2. Hitting level 2 shows you've got a robust institutionalized security program. And for this level, the assessment could be either another self-assessment or it could require a third-party assessment by what's called a C3PAO.
C3PAO, Certified Third-Party Assessment Organization.
Exactly. And then finally, there's level 3, expert. This is really reserved for CUI tied to critical programs, high-value assets. It includes all 110 requirements from Level 2, plus a subset of 24 enhanced security requirements from NIST SP 800-172. Level 3 assessments, they're rarer.
Yeah.
And they're government-led, typically by the DCMA, DIB-SIKI.
Right. So for our audience, the manufacturers, the immediate focus is really level 1 and level 2, especially with phase 1 rolling out. This is where it gets real. What does phase 1 demand right now for contract eligibility?
Phase 1, yeah, it's meant to ease the DIB into this, but the expectations are definitely firm. The DoD's stated intention is to include the requirement for CMMC statuses of either Level 1 self or Level 2 self for all applicable solicitations and contracts. And that starts basically as a condition of contract award, beginning on that effective date of the acquisition rule.
That distinction, Level 2 self-assessment, that feels like a huge pressure point. It means the manufacturer, the OSA organization seeking assessment, they do the internal check themselves, maybe with a consultant's help, following the CMMC assessment process, the CAP. But that final sign-off, the affirmation of compliance, it rests squarely on the shoulders of a company executive or senior official.
That's the absolute crucial liability point. When an executive signs off, attesting to the DoD that their system meets all 110 controls for Level 2, even in this initial self-assessment phase, they are legally affirming it. It's on them. Failure to accurately assess and report compliance. That's not just some administrative slap on the wrist.
Right.
It potentially exposes the company to False Claims Act liability. Huge implication.
Wow, okay.
Which is why that first step can't be about cutting corners. It has to be about building an accurate, a defensible, and crucially, a documented security posture from day one.
That really drives home the seriousness, which answers my next thought. Given how severe that affirmation is, what sort of red flags might make the DoD say, hold on, we need a C3PAO audit, even during this phase 1 period?
Well, the DoD absolutely maintains the right to require a Level 2 C3PAO assessment. They can base that on the criticality of the contract, the risk involved, or maybe the specific type of CUI being handled. For manufacturers, think about it this way. If your contract involves, say, highly sensitive design data for a next-gen weapon system, or maybe your company has a history of known unresolved security incidents.
That could trigger?
That could absolutely trigger the requirement for a mandatory third-party assessment right out of the gate, even while most other companies are focusing on self-assessment. The key takeaway, though, is that the compliance requirement itself, whether you self-affirm it or it gets verified by a C3PO, it must flow down the supply chain.
The flow down. Always critical in DoD work.
Always. Primes have to ensure their subs comply. Those subs have to ensure their lower-tier suppliers comply. Basically, if you touch FCI or CUI, no one is exempt. You're in the scope.
Okay, so the message is crystal clear. Even if you don't expect an external assessor knocking soon, you must prepare as if they are, because the executive's name is going on that compliance affirmation. Which brings us right to preparation. All right, for manufacturing execs in Idaho, let's be honest, the pressure is usually on production schedules, right? Not paperwork. So how do we convince them that actually spending time on documentation before they even touch the hardware, that's truly the fastest, most economical path to CMMC compliance? What's the single most vital document they need to kick this whole thing off?
It's the system security plan. The SSP, we just cannot overstate how critical this document is. It's the absolute prerequisite for any CMMC assessment. Doesn't matter if it's Level 1 self-assessment or Level 2.
Right.
And it's not just paperwork, really. It's the comprehensive blueprint. It details your entire security program and, crucially, defines your CUI environment.
The blueprint. I like that.
Yeah, and to your point about bureaucracy for a small manufacturer, look, the SSP doesn't need to be some 200-page monster. It needs to be scalable, sure, but clear and comprehensive enough to accurately map out the scope and the controls. But here's the non-negotiable part, straight from the official guidance. The absence of an up-to-date SSP at the time of the assessment would result in a finding that an assessment could not be completed, period. full stop.
Okay, so that's the bureaucratic brick wall right there. No SSP ready. The whole CMMC process halts before it even starts. What are the usual mistakes or pitfalls manufacturers hit when they try to create an SSP? What absolutely has to be in there?
I think the biggest pitfall is treating it like a history report,
Yeah.
Writing down what you think you do after the fact instead of using it as a forward-looking design document, a plan. A really robust SSP, it's got to include a few key things. 1, system boundaries. You need a crystal clear definition, often with network diagrams showing the hardware, the software, the firmware that actually makes up the information system handling CUI.
Define the playground.
Exactly. 2, implementation details. For every single control, it's 15 for level 1, all 110 for level 2. The SSP has to spell out how you meet that requirement. What tech are you using? What's the process? Who's responsible? 3, connections and dependencies. It needs to describe how this system connects to other systems, both inside your network and outside, think cloud services, outsourced IT providers. And 4, and this is important for level 2 especially, plan of action and milestones, or POAMs. If you're not fully compliant with certain level 2 controls yet, the SSP must reference a POAM. That document details the security gaps, what resources you need to fix them, and estimated completion dates.
So it acknowledges where you are and outlines the path forward.
Precisely. And one more thing, the SSP is a living document. It's not set and forget. Your organization has to define how often you'll update it. The requirement is at least annually or sooner if there's a significant change in your system or environment, keeping it current. That's the difference between having a truly compliant environment and just having a theoretical one on paper.
That makes perfect sense. And it leads right into the infrastructure needed to support this. If the SSP is the map, manufacturers kind of need a vehicle, right? A way to manage this whole compliance journey. What foundational steps should they take right now to set up maybe a lightweight governance, risk, and compliance GRC framework?
Yeah, lightweight is the key for small to medium manufacturers. You don't need some $1 million GRC software suite right away. It just needs to be functional and critically auditable. So the immediate practical roadmap, I'd say focus on launching 3 integrated components. First, a policy and control library. This is basically where you keep all the written policies that state your intent and the procedures for how you meet those 110 controls. Consistency is key. You can often start with templates derived from NIST SP 800-171 guidance itself.
Okay, policies first.
Second, risk and vendor registers. You need simple tracking tools, honestly. Often shared controlled spreadsheets work fine initially. You use them to document identified cybersecurity risks and track all your external vendors, your IT provider, ESP, cloud services, key software vendors. This helps manage that whole supply chain risk flow down we talked about. And third, probably the most critical piece for the actual assessment, an evidence locker. This needs to be a central secure spot, maybe a SharePoint site, a dedicated secure file share, even a robust ticketing system can work. It's where all the proof lives.
Proof like what?
Logs, change control records, security incident reports, vulnerability scan results, system configuration snapshots, everything. Because if you can't show the evidence during an assessment, you can't prove you're actually doing the control. No evidence, no credit. And one last recommendation here. Think about conducting a C2M2 self-assessment workshop soon. C2M2 is the cybersecurity capability maturity model. It's a great way to get a baseline score for your current state in key areas like access control, incident response. And that directly feeds into identifying gaps for your SSP and your POAMs.
That's a really actionable structure. Policy library, risk vendor tracking, evidence locker, and a baseline assessment. Okay, let's shift from the GRC foundation to the hands-on technical controls. The quick wins. What's a low-hanging fruit, especially around identity and access control, or IAC? Things that apply across both level 1 and level 2 and give manufacturers the biggest security bang for their buck right away.
Oh yeah, IAC is definitely where you get tremendous value quickly. It often neutralizes some of the most common, simplest attack vectors. First, mandatory multi-factor authentication, MFA. This just isn't optional anymore, period. You have got to enforce MFA, especially for any remote access, and definitely for access to CUI. The specific control, IA.L2 3.5.3, actually requires MFA for network access even to non-privileged accounts. Regular user accounts. For admins, privileged accounts, it's absolutely non-negotiable.
That one control makes a huge difference.
Huge. It dramatically limits the risk from compromised passwords, which is still how most breaches start. We still see too many manufacturers relying on just a single password for remote access to critical systems. That has to stop immediately. Second, Kill the shared and default accounts. Get rid of generic admin accounts, shared logins, and make absolutely sure all default passwords on any new piece of equipment, a firewall, a server, even a simple network-attached storage device are changed before it goes live on your network. Default passwords, they're all over the internet. It's a massive, basic, level 1 failure point if you miss that.
Easy fix, big impact.
It's exactly. Third, implement least privilege access. Define roles very specifically. Control AC.L2-3.1.2 mandates limiting access based on specific approved roles. Ask the question, does the production foreman really need creator at elite update access to the main CUI repository? Or maybe just read-only access for certain operational files. By restricting access only to what's needed for the job, you seriously contain the potential damage if an account does get compromised. And fourth, restrict functionality. This one's key too. Control CM.L2 3.4.7. It requires you to restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. Simple example. If you don't use FTP, disable it on your servers. If a machine on the factory floor doesn't need external web access, block it at the firewall. Every non-essential thing you turn off shrinks your attack surface, makes you a harder target.
Okay, MFA, no share default accounts, least privilege, restrict functionality. That's a clear, executable priority list. But now we got to tackle the really tricky part of a manufacturer's network, that operational technology environment, the OT. Yeah, here's where things get really nuanced and potentially pretty expensive for manufacturers. Because they aren't just managing laptops and email servers, are they? They've got robotics, maybe older industrial control systems, SCADA systems, specialized sensors, sometimes decades-old machinery that just plain cannot run modern security software. So how does CMMC handle these? How do we scope these operational technology OT assets? And things like IoT devices, what about those specialized assets?
Right, this is a huge area of concern. And thankfully, the CMMC assessment process guidance does dedicate specific attention to this manufacturing reality. It starts with defining the CMMC assessment scope. The scope is basically the set of all assets in your environment that need to be assessed because they process, store, or transmit FCI or CUI. The real goal here is to draw that boundary precisely, so you only end up assessing what absolutely necessary. You don't want to overscope.
Makes sense. Minimize the burden where possible.
Exactly. And the guidance defines 4 key asset categories that really impact that scope. Manufacturers need to understand all 4 to manage this effectively. We already talked about CUI assets, right? Those process, store, or transmit CUI. They're the core focus. They have to be assessed against all 110 level 2 security requirements. No getting around that. Then next up, you have contractor risk managed assets, or CRMA. This is specifically at level 2. These are typically general IT assets. Think standard laptops or workstations. They could technically connect to the CUI environment, but because you have strong security policies, maybe network segmentation or other controls in place, they're not intended to actually process, store, or transmit CUI.
Give me an example.
Okay, think of an engineer's laptop. Maybe sometimes it connects to the factory floor network to configure a machine, but it's explicitly blocked by a firewall rule from ever accessing the main CUI file server or repository. That laptop could be a CRMA.
Okay, so if the documentation back to the SSP, again, clearly proves these CRMA assets are properly separated, maybe through network segmentation, strong access controls, clear policy, what happens then?
Then, generally speaking, they are not assessed against the other CMMC security requirements. The assessor performs what's called a limited check, basically just to verify that the separation and the policies you claim are real and defensible. And crucially, the guidance specifically states this limited check cannot materially increase the assessment duration or cost. So it's the DoD accepting a calculated risk, but one that the contractor is actively managing and documenting.
Okay, that requires really solid documentation of that separation. But let's get to the heart of the matter for many manufacturers. That legacy CNC machine, or the welding robot running some ancient OS.
Right. That brings us to the specialized assets category. This is the bucket for things like Internet of Things, IoT devices, industrial IoT, IoT, the operational technology, OT we mentioned, industrial control systems, ICS, even government-furnished equipment, GFE, sometimes falls here, or specialized test equipment. Now, here's the key distinguishing factor for this category. These assets might process CUI, maybe they receive operational parameters derived directly from CUI technical drawings, but, and this is the critical part, they are unable to be fully secured against the entire suite of NIST SP 800-171 controls.
Quite unusual.
Usually because of their physical nature, maybe they lack the processing power, or they require proprietary operating systems that can't be patched or hardened in the standard way.
So that 15-year-old machine running, say, Windows XP embedded, which we know is fundamentally insecure, if it can't reasonably be upgraded, it likely falls here.
Exactly, provided it interacts with CUI in some way. So what's the compliance path for that specialized asset at level 2? The path is really about documentation and active risk management. The OSA, the manufacturer, has to document these assets thoroughly in their asset inventory and in the SSP. And they must demonstrate that these assets are being managed using the contractor's own risk-based security policies. Now, here is the major concession, the relief valve for manufacturers. Specialized assets are not assessed against the other CMMC security requirements at level 2.
Say that again, not assessed.
Correct. You document them. You clearly show how you're managing the risk through your policies. Maybe that involves strict physical controls around the machine, isolating it on its own network segment, rigorous monitoring for any weird activity. But the assessor doesn't hold that specific legacy machine to the same 110 control standard as, say, your main engineering server that stores CUI.
Wow, okay, that is a critical clarification. That potentially saves manufacturers from thinking they have to scrap entire, otherwise functional production lines just because the controller can't meet some modern software security requirement it physically can't support. But proving risk-based management still sounds like it could be tricky.
It definitely requires effort and proof of what we call compensating controls. So if you can't implement robust software patching on that old controller, you must compensate elsewhere. Maybe you isolate it on its own dedicated network subnet. Maybe you use a unidirectional network gateway so data can only flow one way. You strictly limit any network communication it's allowed to have. You ensure physical access controls around it are absolutely paramount. The SSP has to clearly articulate what those compensating controls are and the justification for why you're using them instead of the standard control. It's about showing you understand the risk and are actively managing it. And then there's one final category that helps shrink the scope even further. Out-of-scope assets. These are assets that simply cannot process, store, or transmit CUI, and they don't provide any security protections for the CUI assets either. They have to be physically or logically separated. A common example. A completely separate corporate network used only for HR and payroll functions that's usually out of scope. Or, as the guidance itself notes, think about an endpoint, a thin client maybe, that hosts a virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI client. If that VDI is configured so that CUI cannot be stored locally on the endpoint, it only displays pixels, handles keyboard mouse input, then that endpoint itself is often considered out of scope. That can massively reduce the number of devices you actually need to assess.
Okay, so scoping isn't just listing assets. It's a strategic exercise. It's about drawing clear boundaries, leveraging separation where possible, documenting rigorously, and using that specialized asset category judiciously, only when full technical compliance just isn't feasible. But it hinges on meticulous work in the SSP to justify all those decisions. The payoff, though, is potentially a much smaller, more manageable assessment area. All right, we've nailed down the phase 1 target, level 1 and level 2 self-assessment. We know the absolute foundational requirement is getting that SSP right. Now let's help manufacturers focus their limited resources effectively. The CMMC scoring methodology itself kind of gives us clues, right? It tells us exactly where the DoD places the highest value, because missing certain things leads to immediate, significant point deductions. We need to zero in on those 5-point requirements.
That's exactly right. The level 2 scoring methodology is actually a really powerful tool for prioritization. Think about it. For level 2, there are 110 requirements, and meeting all of them gets you the maximum score. But the DoD has specifically identified certain requirements where, if they're not implemented, the risk of network exploitation or CUI getting exfiltrated goes way up. If you miss just one of these specific controls, you are immediately docked 5 points from your total assessment score.
5 points is a big hit.
It's huge. So manufacturers getting ready for that self-assessment, they absolutely must tackle these high-value 5-point controls first, get these right before anything else. We can probably highlight 4 of the most critical domains right now.
Okay, let's start with one that sounds basic, but you often see it misconfigured. System and information integrity. What's the key 5-pointer there?
The specific control is SI.L2-3.14.4. Update malicious code protection. Now, why is this a 5-point deduction? Simple. Malware evolves constantly, hourly, sometimes even faster. If your anti-malware system, your antivirus, has out-of-date definitions, it's practically useless against new threats, and the implementation detail here is absolutely crucial. Your configuration must automatically check for and install malware definition updates every single day, or even more frequently based on vendor threat intelligence feeds.
Not weekly, not manually.
Absolutely not. If a manufacturer's systems only check for updates once a week, or worse, rely on some busy IT technician remembering to do it manually, That control has failed. 5 points gone. This needs centralized management, automated enforcement across all the systems that handle CUI. That includes maybe those dedicated production servers tucked away in a corner that sometimes get forgotten. Missing this, it's like leaving the front door wide open to known, easily preventable attacks. It's foundational.
Okay, daily automated malware updates. Non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Got it. What's the next major 5-point area, maybe focusing on system hygiene?
That would be configuration management, specifically CM.L 23.4.1, system baselining. This control dictates that all your systems must be built and configured starting from a known, secure, and officially approved configuration baseline.
A baseline. Why does just setting a baseline carry such a heavy point deduction? What's the risk?
The risk is something called configuration drift. If you don't define a secure baseline, let's say standard secure settings for a Windows 11 workstation or for a Cisco network router, then every time a new machine gets deployed, or maybe an administrator makes a quick ad hoc change without documenting it, the overall security posture weakens, and it weakens in an unauditable, untrackable way. You end up with this mixed bag, a heterogeneous environment potentially full of unknown vulnerabilities. The 5-point deduction reflects the fact that without solid baselines, you can't really trust the security status of any individual component in your CUI environment.
So how do manufacturers do this?
They should be using established security configuration guides. Things like the CIS benchmarks are excellent to define those secure, restrictive settings. And then, ideally, use centralized configuration management tools to enforce those baselines and detect any deviations.
Okay, baseline configurations. Next, we touched on access control earlier. Which specific control in that domain gets the 5-point priority?
That's access control AC.L2-3.1.1, authorized access control. This one's fundamental. You must control who gets access to the system based on their authorized identity, whether that's a user, a process, or maybe even a device. What this means in practice is you need an active, up-to-date internal list, a list of all authorized users, what their defined roles are, and specifically what CUI or system functions they are allowed to access.
And this ties back to MFA.
Directly. It leverages the identification and authentication mechanisms like MFA, which is covered under IA.L2A2 3.5.1. If your system can't reliably verify who is trying to access the CUI and why they should have access based on that authorized list, well, then the entire environment is vulnerable. Could be insider threat, could be an external compromise using stolen credentials. Failing this control means you've essentially failed to lock the door to the data itself. For manufacturers, this often means going back and reviewing legacy systems where maybe employees historically had broad blanket access. That needs to change. Access now must be strictly limited by necessity, by role.
Makes sense. Lock the door, check the ID. Finally, what about visibility? If something does go wrong, what's the key documentation or logging failure point that costs 5 points?
That falls under audit and accountability. Specifically, AUL2 3.3.1. System auditing. This requires you to create and, importantly, retain audit logs. And those logs need to be detailed enough to enable effective monitoring, analysis, investigation, and reporting if any unlawful or unauthorized system activity happens. The devil is in the detail here. The logs must contain sufficient information. What does that mean? It means clear timestamps, source and destination IP addresses, unique user IDs, the specific event that occurred, enough detail to trace actions back unequivocally to a source.
So if there's a breach,
If a breach happens and you look at your logs and you cannot definitively trace the attacker's movements, figure out exactly what data they accessed, and identify the user account that was compromised, you fail this 5-point control. Full stop. This almost always requires a dedicated log management solution, something that can centralize logs from different systems, and those logs have to be protected from being tampered with or deleted, and they generally need to be retained for at least 1 year. Often longer, depending on specific contract requirements. We see too many small manufacturers maybe collecting logs locally on servers, but they don't centralize them, they don't protect them adequately, and crucially, they don't routinely review them for anomalies. Collecting logs isn't enough, you have to use them.
okay, those 4 are critical. Automated malware updates, system baselining, strict authorized access control, and comprehensive, usable logging. That provides a very clear focus for where manufacturers should put their immediate time and money. Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room you mentioned, cost. The DoD's estimate, roughly $34,277 for a small entity, to do the level 2 self-assessment and affirmation. How does that actually break down? How should an executive realistically budget for achieving this?
Yeah, that $34,277 figure. It's an official estimate trying to capture the total cost, labor, tools, everything for that initial self-assessment and the executive affirmation. And you're right, it's a significant investment, especially for smaller shops. It's not trivial. Where does that money typically go for a small entity? I'd break it down to roughly 3 key areas. 1, internal staff labor. This is often the biggest chunk, honestly. It's the hours your existing management team, your IT staff, maybe even production leadership, spend writing the SSP, creating those GRC documents we talked about, gathering all the evidence for the 1 in 10 controls, and actually performing the necessary configuration changes on your systems.
Time is money.
Absolutely. 2, consulting and advisory services. Given how complex the 110 controls are and how high the stakes are with that executive affirmation, the DoD guidance explicitly notes that small entities are likely to need help. They'll probably outsource IT and cybersecurity support to an external service provider, an ESP. A good chunk of that $34K often goes towards paying for expert advisory hours, help with scoping, developing the SSP correctly, maybe doing a pre-assessment gap analysis. And 3, tooling and software. There will likely be investment needed in specific security tools to actually meet some of those 5-point requirements we just discussed. Things like professional-grade MFA solutions, maybe a robust security information and event management SIEM system for logging, centralized patch management software, tools for automated baseline configuration monitoring.
Okay, so framing it that way makes more sense. It's not really a certification fee, per se. It's the actual cost of achieving the required security posture to pass the assessment. And you mentioned external service provider as ESPS. What's the executive's responsibility, the due diligence, when they pick an IT partner, especially since, as you said, that partner might actually fall into the scope of their own CMMC assessment?
Due diligence here is absolutely critical because if your ESP is not what's defined as a cloud service provider, CSP, meaning if they're the ones managing your local CUI environment, maybe doing your data backups, managing user accounts on your network, then their services must be assessed right alongside yours within the scope of your CMMC assessment against all the applicable level 2 security requirements.
So your IT provider's security posture directly impacts your CMMC success.
Directly. You absolutely need assurance from your ESP that they themselves are prepared for CMMC scrutiny. You need to know how they meet the requirements relevant to the services they provide you. Their role needs to be documented precisely in your SSP. And they really should provide you with a detailed service description, or ideally what's called a customer responsibility matrix, a CRM. That CRM clarifies exactly which CMMC controls they are responsible for managing and which ones remain your responsibility as the customer. Bottom line, if your IT partner isn't ready for CMMC, they instantly become a significant risk, a liability that could completely derail your own certification effort. Choose your partners wisely.
This has been incredibly helpful. I feel like we've laid out a clear, really actionable roadmap here. We've moved the Idaho manufacturer from just understanding the basic mandate to thinking strategically about scoping their unique OT environment and now focusing on those critical high-value controls they need for that phase 1 self-assessment.
And maybe that raises one last important strategic question for executives listening. We spent time distinguishing between your standard CUI assets and those specialized assets, like your legacy OT equipment. Now, while the CMMC rule allows you to manage the risk of those specialized assets through policy and compensating controls, executives need to ask, what does it truly cost your organization long-term in terms of complexity, ongoing management effort, maybe needing costly physical separation projects? What's the cost of perpetually managing the risk of having assets on your network that are fundamentally unable to be fully secured? Versus the potential cost and maybe the long-term benefit of actually modernizing or replacing that legacy component. The official guidance itself hints at this. It notes that the difficulty of meeting security principles like in control SCL 2 3.13.2 will likely increase as these legacy components age. So that short-term decision today to categorize an asset as specialized to get through the assessment, it really needs to be viewed through a longer-term technology investment strategy. Security lifecycle management has to start influencing production technology purchasing decisions now.
That's a powerful final thought. Balancing immediate compliance needs with long-term security posture and technology strategy.
Exactly. And look, if this deep dive today has sparked more questions maybe about the nitty-gritty of implementing the SSP or the specific scoping challenges on your particular factory floor, or just how to get started right here in Idaho, please remember there are local resources available. Specifically, Total Care IT is hosting a webinar on November 5th. They'll be digging into exactly these kinds of foundational CMMC questions, providing further guidance on execution. If you need that next level of detailed implementation support, we strongly encourage you to check that out.
Excellent point, and a great resource to highlight. Thank you again for guiding us through this essential and admittedly challenging compliance roadmap today. Really valuable insights.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Shift Change. To learn more about how IT can help your manufacturing business invest in future competitiveness, reach out to Total Care IT today.